Hi, I'm Denise Simmons, Cambridge City Councilor, and also the chair of a wonderful project, the Cambridge Museum of History and Culture, which we want to let you know more about, but not today. Today we're going to be talking about pride and the LGBT plus Q community. I guess you will correct me if I'm wrong, either of you. June is typically called Pride Month, but I like to think of Pride being one of those things that we celebrate every day and every way. So June is the month that we highlight the achievements, the people, the things that the community does and celebrates and thinks about. But I want you to think about Pride 365 because we're here 365 days of the year doing what we all do, which is being loud, proud. Well, maybe not all of us are loud, but certainly proud and standing out. I'm just really pleased today to have this conversation with good friends to talk about the LGBT plus community. And please, I'm going to struggle with this, I think, the whole time, but LGBTI plus community.
You forgot the Q.
I forgot the Q. I'm sorry. I forgot the Q, but Sue was going to tell you about the Q. Community and looking backwards and looking forwards. You know, where we are, where we've been, where we want to go. As we sit in Cambridge, which is a wonderful place, and I always, as my wife would say, the la la land of Cambridge, we do live in a larger state, and of course, we live in a larger universe called the US of A. And what does that look like for our community, for the community? Well, we're going to talk a little bit about that. I am very pleased to have with us a wonderful group of individuals. They're going to share their thoughts about the LGBTQ plus I community.
You're getting there.
Thank you. That's why Sue's sitting over here to help me along. But you know, when I think about Cambridge, you know, Cambridge is a pretty special place. We've done a lot of things. So I'm just going to give you a brief history. In 1983, the Old Cambridge Baptist Church declared itself welcoming and affirming LGBT. They didn't have the I, the Q, or the plus people. And that they were the first of only 7 faith congregations in Cambridge to do that. In 1984, Cambridge became the first city in the Commonwealth to enact non-discrimination laws based on sexual orientation. In 1988, Project 10 East, the first public school gay-straight alliance in the public schools east of the Mississippi, and at the time, the second only in the country, and that was founded at our high school, Cambridge Ranch and Latin. Kathy Keegan, I believe, was the coordinator at the time. Then in 1992, Cambridge became the first city in the Commonwealth to enact domestic partner legislation. Rolling right along in 1997, the Cambridge School Committee, under moi, I think I was a member of the school committee at the time, established the dedicated position of LGBT family liaison. And that was to ensure that LGBTQI plus families would be welcomed in our schools. And then in 2004, this was a wonderful moment in Cambridge. Cambridge became the first city in the Commonwealth and in the nation to issue marriage licenses to same-sex couples.
And in the world.
And in the world. Thank you. They're in the world. And then in 2005, the Cambridge LGBT Commission was established to advocate for the culture and respect of the LGBT community, but also to monitor the progress that we are making toward LGBT issues in general. So when I think of this conversation, I'm going to just start with one of my favorite quotes, if I can find it here. When, you know, we recently had the Pride Breakfast, which goes back for 20 years?
It goes back to 1991.
1991. So Alice Wolf, I want to say, was the mayor at the time, and she established that. And we had a little hiatus, a period where we didn't do it because of COVID-19. So this last Saturday, we were able to get together and have that Pride Breakfast once again. And it was great to see everyone again. At that breakfast, we have a new award that we present. It's called the Bayard Rustin Award. And it's given typically to a person of color that typifies the work and the type of person Bayard Rustin is or was. But one of the things that he said, a quote that I like, and I'm going to share it with you, and it goes as follows. When an individual is protesting society's refusing to acknowledge their dignity, their very act of protest confers dignity upon them. I want to have you join me in welcoming my guests who I would say really do the job of conferring dignity on our community. I'm going to let them introduce themselves, but we're going to have a rip-roaring, informal, but politically provocative conversation about where we are, where we've been, and where we'd like to go. We're going to start with Pooja Kranthal. Pooja, introduce yourself.
Hi, everyone. I'm so glad to be part of this conversation and be part of our talk today. So my name is Pooja Kranthal. I use he, him pronouns, and I am the Youth Leadership and Advocacy Coordinator at the YWCA Cambridge. And I also grew up in Cambridge, and Denise has always been someone that I've looked up to, and I always thought that every mayor was as amazing as Denise when I was, 10, 9, 8, all of those ages.
Thank you. Matthew Martin.
Hi, my name is Matthew Martin. My pronouns are he, him, his. I am a program manager for the Office of Long-Term Supports and Services, and I also happen to be the chair of the EHS Diversity Council at the state, basically Mass Health. So I've known Denise for many years. I knew her when she was a city councilor when I was a teenager. Not a city councilor, excuse me, on the school board, then a city councilor, and then mayor. So, and I'm also friends with the daughter too.
Right. Didn't you? I think they came close to going to prom together.
Yeah,
Maybe not.
yeah,
We won't talk about the prom story. That was a real struggle for me as a parent. But maybe we'll have time for that. Suhaid.
Madam Mayor, esteemed colleagues, and hello, folks watching through the TV. My name is Sue Hyde. I've lived in Cambridge since 1983. I've known Denise Simmons not for all of those years, but for many. And it's a pleasure to be here. I spent about 30 years at the National LGBTQ Task Force, where I ran the annual Creating Change Conference and Organizing and Training Conference for LGBTQ leaders, advocates, and organizers. And I'm currently the executive director of the Wild Geese Foundation. We do not fund geese.
This is good to know.
I know.
Professor McCarthy.
Thank you. Yeah. Hi, everyone. My name is Tim McCarthy, and I am on the faculty. I teach on the faculty at Harvard University. I teach in the Graduate School of Education and at the Kennedy School of Government, where I've taught for many, many years. I'm losing track now. I'm a historian of social movements, and so I study social change movements here in the United States and comparatively across the globe. I've written and taught about this for about 30 years now. I've been a proud Cantabrigian ever since I came to college here in the summer of 1989, and I've lived here most of my adult life and have been very active in the community. I was in the Big Brother Big Sister program. I taught in the Cambridge Public Schools. I've done a lot of work also most recently with you on public monuments and public art. So I love this city, and Denise will always be my mayor, and I've voted for you more times than I can count, so, and will continue to do so for as long as you are in the game. Thanks for having me.
No, thanks everyone, each of you, for being here. Now, Tim, we're going to be on a first name basis, if that's all right with everybody?
Yep.
Okay, great.
Certainly, Madam Mayor.
Tim, in your opening remarks, you talked about the studying history and social movement. So I'm going to start with you. One of the questions I wanted to talk about was, many people pinpoint the beginning of the modern LGBTQ plus civil rights movement as beginning with the immediate aftermath of the Stonewall riots in 1969. How would you describe the LGBTQ community of that era? And in terms of rights and in terms of acceptance and protections and our place in the larger society, let's lead with that, and please feel free to jump in. Okay, so Tim?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people center the one origin story of the LGBTQ movement at Stonewall, right? The riots, and they were riots that took place over the course of 5 or 6 days in late June and early July of 1969, and there are good reason for that. It was a sustained protest. It involved hundreds, if not thousands, of people. There were many arrests. There was violence, resistance to the police raid on the Stonewall Inn, and certainly all of the things that happened in that particular moment represented a kind of sea change. Some people call it a spark, some people call it a firecracker, some people call it a sea change, whatever, pick your metaphor, but it was very important. The thing about Stonewall, though, as important as it was as one origin point for the movement, is it wasn't the first protest, it wasn't the first police raid, it wasn't the first act of resistance, it wasn't the first kind of public protest. There had been quite a number of those going back at least a decade in the 1960s, even back into the 1950s. And so I think it's really important for us to see Stonewall as part of a landscape of insurgency, right, where LGBTQ people came to a place where they decided to do what Bayard Rustin was talking about, is to protest against the laws and the systems of oppression that were dehumanizing them, diminishing them, and discriminating against them. And it was a time of pervasive dehumanization and devaluing and discrimination in almost every institution and almost every level of society. And so these folks who called themselves liberationists, they didn't talk as much about civil rights the way that we might talk about it today. They talked about liberation. They talked about power, right? They talked about pride. And this was a time where I think there was a radical insurgency against these systems of oppression that were, really making people's lives miserable. But they came together to organize in all sorts of ways.
Anyone else want to jump in on
I
that?
would like to jump in.
Okay, Sue.
So, Tim, I think you're quite right that Stonewall was not the spark that launched the revolution, but it put more kindling and more logs on that than anything else had, in part because it was a spectacular reaction, response, refusal to simply get into the police vans when the cops came to the bar to shut it down one more time. And it happened in New York City. And it was covered actually pretty badly by the New York Times and by other publications and other outlets. But because it got that coverage, it also got coverage in weekly news magazines. I was a 16-year-old little baby dyke in Beardstown, Illinois, and I read about the Stonewall riots. It was about that much copy. It was like 5 or 6 inches of copy. I read about it in July 1969. And I said to my pal, Rick, I want to do that. And there's no way to know how many of us read about it and thought, this is inspiring to me in my life. But it has to be a very great many people. Now, at the time, the movement was not much of a movement, except in certain large cities and primarily on the coasts. 1969, New York City, Washington, D.C., glimmerings in Boston, Chicago, Illinois, the outlier, not on the coast, San Francisco, California, and Los Angeles, Seattle. But for the most part, there was not a national movement organization. That wouldn't happen until 1973, when the National Gay Task Force was founded. The biggest agenda item for queer people in 1969 was get the government out of my life, get the police out of my bars, get the cops away from my bedroom, and leave me alone.
That's right.
And obviously, we've expanded that quite a bit.
Just a bit. Matt, I knew you wanted to kind of get in on this.
So it's interesting to think about 1969. Obviously, I wasn't alive in 1969, in 1969, only one state had decriminalized same-sex sexual relations, and that was Illinois in 1962. So, I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, they wanted to get the government out of their bedrooms. And in fact, I think at Stonewall, 3 articles of clothing, I think the law was that you had to have 3 articles of clothing that matched your gender identity as affirmed at your birth, I guess, because they didn't do the gender identity. And otherwise, it was illegal. So it's interesting that the folks that started the Stonewall riot happened to be trans people, and I believe it might have been trans women of color, because they're the ones at the most marginal level of society, so they felt like they had the least to lose probably when they fought back against the police that night. So just to think 49 states had criminalized same-sex contact, and it's just, yeah, it must have been a very difficult place for them to be in. Yeah.
A very difficult place indeed. Who's your, not having been around?
I think it's pretty obvious.
But do you have any thoughts about that? I mean, is when you think about the modern, the LGBT civil rights movement, what comes to mind for you? What was that watershed moment for you?
Yeah, well, I think it's just fascinating knowing and learning about Stonewall, especially I feel like in the past 3 years. Now it's a lot more broadly known as a riot, but it's still seen as like a celebration, and it really was a riot. And growing up, when I was like, oh wait, I think I have gay lesbian parents, my family's all lesbian, I'm also gay, what a surprise. I think it was important that I didn't know anything about Stonewall, and there was so much of the history, like I knew about our Cambridge history, but there was so much of the history that we weren't taught in schools, still aren't taught in schools, and are misrepresented. So especially, like, you know, you said Stonewall was primarily started by Black trans women, by street kids, by sex workers, and even during that time, the movement, especially like lesbian and gay folks and just other people, really weren't giving them the credit, and still they aren't receiving that credit of who really started it.
But that's a good point. The LGBT community, particularly the LGBT community of color, where is the credit? Why does that happen? Why is our history so suppressed? What are your thoughts when you think about that? Are we reluctant to talk about it still?
I would think that when movements get going, they get going based on who's in the mainstream. Even with the civil rights, the Black civil rights movement, Martin Luther King was picked over Bayard Rustin because he was heterosexual, a preacher. He was a middle class person. They weren't going to pick a poor Black person who was queer. When movements are led, or even the women's movement, the Susan B. Anthony's, it tends to be white women of means, right? So when with any movement, you're trying to put forward the foot that will scare society and the establishment the least, right? Middle class Black folks. You want to, even with gays, cisgender white gays, right? And probably ones who aren't poor. So I think that's what's going on often with the Stonewall movement. If it has a cisgender white male face, it's a little less threatening. And some, even cisgender white, and the gender has to match the sex. You know what I mean? It can't. You're not going to pick a feminine man or a masculine woman. You're going to pick people who are very traditional in their sex roles too, and they will tend to be white, and they will tend to be middle class or upper middle class.
Able-bodied.
And able-bodied. Thank you for adding that. Yeah.
Agree or disagree? What do you think?
Well,
what are your thoughts?
Tim, you mentioned the liberationists and liberation agendas. And shortly after Stonewall, in the fall, 1969, or maybe it was the summer, the Gay Liberation Front was born in New York City. And it flourished in a kind of way. It flourished for about, I believe, a year and a half, and then it flamed out. So why did it flame out? That agenda was what any elected politician, elected office holder would view as radical, impossible, not presented to them in segments of gettable, doable wins. And when GLF flamed out, along came who followed them? The Gay and Lesbian Activist Alliance in New York. A different crew of people. The liberationists were not wearing suits and ties, by the way. No. But along came the more presentable folk with an agenda that could be, I will say, understood by elected officials and understood by government officials. And it's not that the liberationist agenda has disappeared or been extinguished, but you're right, it was overtaken by a more traditional political agenda with bites of policy change that were doable and winnable and gettable.
You know, it's interesting because when people talk about history, right, I think it's important for us to think about what happened and what has happened, and also how we tell stories and who tells stories about what happened. And I think one of the reasons why queer people of color or trans women of color have been at times written out of the narrative, even though they have always been there and always were there and will always be there, playing a decisive role in the resistance movement, in the revolution, in the politics of resistance. People who tell the story of that time or cover it in that moment, right? Think about what's the press representation of Stonewall, of a protest, right? And I think that, you know, it's important, it's incumbent upon people like me, historians, and all of us, we're all historians in a way. If we tell stories about the past, we're all engaging as historians in some way in the world. And I think it's really important for us to look at all of the things that are happening so that we dive into the mess rather than trying to tidy it up. And too often when we tell stories about the past, particularly movements, right, we try to tidy them up. Like, people tell the story of the Black civil rights movement as if it was always a national movement that was fully coordinated and so forth. No, every single place, Birmingham, Albany, Georgia, right, Montgomery, Alabama, all of these places had their own local stories with their own people, their own leaders, their own folks, their own agendas, and their own tactics and strategies. And so I think when we think about history, it's important for us to sort of try to embrace it all. I mean, the fact of the matter is that we know, based on the historical record, that every type of queer person was at Stonewall in that week, right? And that queer women of color, trans women of color may have thrown the first brick or the first Molotov cocktail or the first punch, and there's a big debate about that. But all different types of folks, all of us in terms of our elders and ancestors, were there in the West Village in those steamy days of late June and early July in 1969, right? And then what role people played is another matter. And then the other point I want to make just quickly is that I think the closer movements come to power, the more privileged voices and peoples get airtime, right? Because when you're going to a congressional testimony, right, they're going to be like leather daddies going to testify before Congress. It's going to be the heads of LGBTQ organizations, right? They need to be legible in some way. Who are the plaintiffs in the major court cases, right? They're usually people who are more identifiable, legible, and respectable to the powers that be. And that power dynamic of privilege and identity is also very much at play when you talk about social change.
And that's very powerful thought process. Just thinking about how we measure where we were and where we want to be and where we even are now. And moving down the historical trail a little bit, you know, all of us were here when President Obama won, and we were all very happy. And if you were Black and gay and a woman and all those different things, you were very excited about it because you said, this was our moment. But was it? I mean, how would you describe the LGBT community and our overall journey from when President Obama took office and the final years? I mean, I know a lot of people had great expectations. I mean, mine's were a little, you know, I wasn't as excited as I would have liked to be because I also knew the reality of who he was and what he was trying to do and who he was doing it for. But any one of you, just jump in. I mean, overall, particularly in his final years, what do you think about Obama's presidency and its impact on our community? Anyone?
Well, I think that the Obama presidency started off in a much more centrist place than it ended when it came to LGBTQI plus rights. So I think in the beginning he was trying to play it safe and said it's an issue that's up to the states, marriage equality, and was on the record as being for the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. I think in 2010 they were able to repeal Don't Ask, Don't Tell in a lame duck session of Congress, which was awesome. I remember that. Then it's because of who he got on the Supreme Court that we had the 5-4 decision in 2015, which gave us marriage equality. And then in the waning years, there was an attempt to allow more access to facilities for trans folks, bathrooms and such. And of course, that was one of the first things Trump did away with when he came in. But I think that the evolution of the Obama administration towards LGBTQ I rights plus rights is something that progressed during the course of his presidency. And yes, we could have wished for more, but I think it was a pretty good run for one presidency, personally.
Your thoughts?
Yeah, the one thing that really stands out to me is that idea that during Pride, during his years, the whole administration and the whole White House really celebrated Pride. And I feel like that was the first time in my lifetime and for everyone that we saw the White House, having a Pride flag. I love that picture of Biden and Obama running down the White House with their with their flags. And I think that, like you said, there was so much that we expected that maybe didn't happen. And Denise, like you said about the expectations of being the first Black president, and I always think of it as always if you always bring up issues specifically for LGBTQ folks, specifically for the Black community, you're seen as oh, well, you're Black, so you're going to bring up these issues. So I feel like he wasn't able to fight in that same way that he wanted to because of the identities that he held.
So one of the things about the Obama years that I really appreciated, and I think goes underappreciated, is that his administration made very specific efforts to recruit and hire and appoint LGBTQ people into positions, not just at the White House, all over the administration. And, when I think about government, I think of government as a bundle of resources. So who's making the decisions about who gets the resources? It isn't just the Congress of the United States. It is those, how many cabinet seats are there? It is those 14,
More than a dozen.
More than a dozen administrative departments that comprise that administration and every administration. And we can see how much, unfortunately, damage can be done that happened during the Trump 4 years. Please not. But you can also see the difference it made during the Obama years to have as many of us as there were making some of those decisions about who got the resources and what were they going to be.
So it's interesting that you would say that, because I don't know if you know this, Denise, but I was one of the founding members of Barack Obama's LGBTQ Leadership Council, National Leadership Council. So I joined the campaign in 2007, and it was interesting because at that point, early in the primary, when you had all these people running, I was sort of like, oh, we'll see. Well, I'm not going to make any decisions now. And then I was invited to an event. I was living in New York at the time, but I was invited to an event in Cambridge. The Obama campaign had organized a meeting in Chicago and in Cambridge of mostly activists, organizers, intellectuals, cultural workers, to see if they would be interested in joining the campaign. And I remember walking into the room. It was at Harvard Law School in Cambridge, and I came back up from New York to go to the meeting. And I'm looking around the room, and it's a lot of people who are progressive community folk, right? And people who are really in the movement and in the work. And I was thinking, this is an interesting outreach. Turns out he did the same thing in Chicago. He didn't just go to the rich people in San Francisco and New York like most of the candidates do. And so right from the very beginning of his presidential aspirations, there was, I think, a commitment to this. I have long said, and I will stand by this, that I think that Barack Obama, in addition to being a very strong ally in chief, will go down in history as the LBJ of the LGBT movement. That I think that he was someone who helped to preside over a whole, and initiate in some ways, although he didn't throw his political capital around for everything, and he was very strategic about what he was going to do when. And the marriage equality thing is one thing. I remember, he was for it as a state senator, and then was against it as a presidential candidate, and then was for it when it became more of an accepted issue nationally. But he did all this work. He did this quiet, under the radar work that Sue's talking about, which is Biden Biden actually has exceeded what Obama did. But Obama had more out LGBTQ appointees in federal agencies than any president in the history of the United States, right? And he came right out at the very beginning with endorsing the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, passing hate crimes legislation, right? So every year of his presidency, there was some new advance that we can, I think, reasonably characterize as progress at a policy level, but also signaling sort of cultural shifts, which his presidency, of course, represented as well, right? Barack Obama is not the leader of our movement, but his very presence in the world as a president and as a political phenomenon, right, is owed to a movement and to movements that made him possible. And then he, in turn, I think, and not to be too rosy about it, he had his limitations and he's too conservative for my taste, but he did do a lot to sort of set things in motion and become what I think is really a kind of model of that kind of high-powered political allyship.
These are all so important. We could just talk about just what it has been. But let's move to right now. You know, we're in the middle of Pride, and this is a time I, kind of get my party mode. And what I mean by party mode, I mean getting to see people I don't usually see and have these conversations and be engaged. And we have to work on doing that over a longer period of time. But here we are, we're in June, it's Pride Month. And so where do you think things currently stand? Right here in the moment. Where do you think we stand around our own rights and our protections in this country?
So, not to be overly partisan, but I couldn't help but be concerned about the current makeup of the Supreme Court, number one. And number two, as part of the backlash against summer racial justice in 2020, we are seeing a slew of critical race theory bans, and riding almost every single one of those bans is language that affects the LGBTQI+ community, whether it's legislation against trans kids or has to do with choice. So that's quite alarming. And a lot of our federal protections are wrapped into the 14th Amendment, right? And the privacy clause. So if what happens with choice happens, which is suspected, it draws into question what other things are protected by the 14th Amendment that this court may take a second look at, like marriage equality, or maybe not ended because I guess with Amy Coney Barrett you still don't have 5 because Neil Gorsuch did side with but it's of concern. So right now we're in a good place, but we'll see with this current court.
I know I'm certainly concerned. It seems that I just recently, when we had our Pride breakfast and I was kind of preparing my remarks, I was thinking about how precious and how fragile. And that didn't hit home to just now in the changing over the Supreme Court. And I said, my word, it just seems like yesterday we were just giddy and happy that we had gotten marriage equality and then federal marriage equality, just to seem like had the door slammed on our toes. But when you think about protections that we all enjoy on some level, are you feeling confident? Are you worried?
I think there's a mix of both, of course, and I think back to how history always repeats itself. So the more representation there is, the more visibility there is, then then there's like that cycle of backlash. So looking at trans rights, and specifically when you brought up critical race theory, I thought of all of the big list of like all of the books that are banned out of the most schools, and how at YWCA Cambridge, we have a gold program and we also have a gender expansive youth program. And in both those programs, we center the voices of marginalized youth. And it's really important, specifically centering trans youth and gender nonconforming youth, is that we look at what the youth are doing and how accepting and supportive and loving they are. And that's not like everyone, but so many of them, because of the media representation, because of what they've grown up, they are able to lead us in knowing that we can really actually support each other with our different identities, our different sexualities, our different genders, and there's no one way to describe your gender or your sexuality or a variety of all of those things. And that really gives me hope. But it also, it makes me scared because we've come so far, and just like all the things you're saying, we can't take that away to move forward, because then we're just continuously fighting the thing that we already fought.
It really gives me hope that you're hopeful. And I mean, I look forward. I see folks like you and Suri and Amani and so many others, because you've done it for such a long time. You're saying, do we have the bandwidth to just kind of not, if we can't move fast forward, at least hold the ground that we have. And so, I turn to you in terms of our protections. We've been in the fight. Very happy for the young folks that are coming. I'm not even going to say behind, but alongside of us. But how do we keep this up? Are you as hopeful about our protections and the rights that we've gained?
No, not at all. We are in the midst of a political dumpster fire.
We really are.
And what is on top of the fire is democracy. And if democracy is not, if the protection and the sustenance of this democracy does not become everyone's first priority in our civic engagements, we're going down. We are going down. Almost half the people in this country think that the 2020 election was stolen from someone.
That's right.
What? No evidence. None whatsoever. But that is the myth that has overtaken half of the people who live here. I don't mean Cambridge. I mean in the United States. And goes Roe, goes the Obergefell decision and the Windsor decisions that recognized our rights to marry and to inherit, goes Lawrence v. Texas, which took down every of the 13 remaining anti-sodomy laws in the United States, goes Griswold, which is the 1965 SCOTUS decision that recognized that a woman had the right to seek contraception from her physician prior to 1965. That was not recognized. Anything goes interracial marriage, anything that invested in a person, a human, the right to make their own decision about fill in the blank, it's going down. Yeah. It's going down with this Supreme Court. It's going down. And my friends, if you're not voting, I beg of you, register and vote, even in the beautiful city of Cambridge, because you're not just voting for Denise, for city council, or for folks on the school committee. We're also voting for members of Congress, we're voting for senators, and we're voting for the president and the vice president. So I realize Biden has been a little bit of a disappointment. I have conversations with my kids about this. I recognize he's not the kind of energetic figure that would inspire young people to vote, as was Barack Obama. But dang, people, we got to get out there.
Right. And yet he got more votes than Barack Obama did, right, in the 2020 election. I mean, dire times, and the dumpster fire is real. I mean, what Sue just said is so important, and you raised this with the Supreme Court piece, that the draft that was leaked of the overturning Roe decision, which we're going to get this week, I think. I mean, it's coming. We're in June, and the Supreme Court's done in a week or so. So that real decision is coming soon. That decision named all of those cases. It named Windsor and Obergefell, which are the marriage cases. It named Lawrence versus Texas, which was the anti-sodomy case. It named Loving versus Virginia, which was the anti-miscegenation case, an interracial marriage case. It named Griswold. It named all of those. And I mean, and this was not a narrow ruling, which the Supreme Court tends to be more conservative, even when it makes really important landmark rulings. They tend to be fairly narrow. This was an expansive wrecking ball of a decision, if indeed it is in accordance with what we've seen in the leak. And so I think it's really important for us, the idea of whether or not I'm hopeful, right? I'm a historian, so I always take the long view, right? And I do believe that arc of history bends towards justice very slowly and steadily, and it does as long as enough of us push it and pull it. But I also understand that whether or not history repeats itself, it certainly does rhyme. And the ebb and flow of history and the way that history sort of moves in terms of progress and reaction, right? What I call the paradox of progress is something that has a long history in the United States. Look at the fall of Reconstruction, right? The abolition of slavery in the aftermath of the Civil War, and the incorporation of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments into the Constitution, and thousands of black men holding elective office for the first time. All these things happen in the aftermath of the Civil War, right? And there was a glorious sort of window of opportunity, this kind of revolutionary moment of interracial democracy following the Civil War. And then what happens? White supremacy rises up, and that interracial democracy comes crumbling down, and it produces literally a generation or more of what historians and others call the nadir, right? This time where racial terror lynchings are on the increase, Jim Crow laws are being put into law. And so the backlash against this progress, whenever people like black people, immigrants, people of color, queer people, women, whenever any of us get out of place or out of line, the backlash is ready to come. And so we're experiencing a paradox of progress right now. This period of swift and telescoped progress during the Obama era, right, the marriage generation, and now this huge backlash for all the reasons you're talking about, these anti-trans bills, these CRT bills. And let's be honest, right, the white supremacists, right, who staged the insurrection on January 6th, we're going to a pride parade in Idaho this week, right? They're coming for all of us. And one of the things that I want to say, in addition to vote, we need to stop fighting with ourselves. Right? We need to stop fighting amongst ourselves. Like they're coming for all of us.
That's right.
And they're not making the distinctions that we may be making, the nuances about identity and language and all of these kinds of things. They're coming for us. And so we have to be really clear about that, because with the backlash is violent, right? It is about voting, absolutely, but there's also a much bigger threat, I think, than just the sort of the anemic or the threat to democracy. I think it's literally a threat to the people, the people that constitute the democracy in the first place.
Yeah. That's what holds up the systems of power, is us all fighting amongst each other.
That's right.
Divided we fall. It's more than a cliche.
And it's funny because you have to push constantly towards that justice, because I think some people think it's a given with the year.
Yeah.
The later the year is, the more justice there will be, and that's not the case. We don't have to go to Weimar Germany or the fall of the Roman Republic to see that the nadir happened. The civil rights movement happened as much, unfortunately, due to the pressure going on from the Soviet Union as it did from internal pressures.
That's right.
The U.S. saw the world map and saw that 82% of the world, 85% of the world wasn't white. They had Oriental Exclusion Acts that banned Asians and Latinos. They were treating African Americans this way, and all the Soviet Union had to do is go around the world and say, "Oh, you're not welcome in that country. Oh, your children will be hosed in the streets in that country."
Look at them talking about freedom all the time.
So it took massive amounts of, not to underscore the genius of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, but because he without him, the movement would have had a lot more struggle. But it did take a foreign threat to light the fire under the U.S. government. So if people don't think things can slide backwards, they absolutely can, and they do. And they're on the precipice of doing that.
Exactly.
So there's not much I can add to my fears about what the court might and is likely to do, and what's happening in state legislatures across the country right now. But we do need to ally with each other in order to get anything done. And we hang separately or you hang together, right? Isn't that the saying?
Yeah, the struggles have to be internal.
Right.
Well, and it's not just within LGBTQ contexts that we need to hang together. We are desperately in need of a kind of progressive cross-movement leadership that does not exist, that I am aware of. And Urvashi Vaid, rest in peace. I wish you were here right now, because she held the vision of that kind of cross movement power.
That's right. She embodied it.
Actually she did very much. And that is what we are in desperate need of
Yeah.
at this moment, and that is what I do not see. And that is partly why I am not very optimistic.
I will say though, the one thing, and maybe this is because you work with young people all the time. The older I get, the more I realize I got to be near young people, because if I'm going to have any hope for hope, it's the young folks. And one of the things that I love, I'm pointing to you because you're the young folk here. Well, you are too, probably. Yeah. Yeah. But I think
That's another conversation for another show.
But the thing that I
good.
think is happening with young people, right? I work with high school students and even middle school kids and college students, graduate students. These rising generations are like, you've got to be kidding me. You're taking this away? No. They grew up, many of them, right, with these kinds of protections, whether you're talking about the right to choose, contraception, you're talking about marriage equality, you're talking about the right to vote, right? All of these kinds of things that many of us have been in the movements to fight for a long time. Right? This generation has grown up as not taking them for granted in a negative way, but being like, yeah, this is part of what it means to live in a democracy, right? We have these rights. And now that these things are being yanked away, we're all like, you've got to be kidding me, Roe's going away. And they're like, oh, no, you're not taking my right to abortion away, right? The urgency that they feel and express and the work that they're doing in terms of organizing and resistance and the way they're challenging the older generations, I think is actually quite profound. Right? There's so many examples of it, right? From the Black Lives Matter movement to the Dreamers movement to the expansive language of gender, right? That they're bringing to our vocabulary.
And gun violence.
And gun violence, right? I mean, all of these issues, they're like at the center of this. And so for me, I'm kind of like, forget about leading things. Right? I want to follow this rising generation because they do, I think, have in their urgency and their proper, justified, channeled anger and rage, right? A vision, I think, for a different kind of world.
Do you agree? I didn't mean to cut you off, though.
I don't want to put any pressure on it.
No pressure.
I'm for all the other
Yeah, right, of course.
Yes. At least for tonight.
Yeah, I do really agree, and that's why I continuously, since I was a teenager, worked with middle schoolers and high schoolers, and that's why my favorite pastime is talking about racial and social justice with them. And I remember when I came out as trans in October, November, they were the ones that also held me and said, here you are, like, you deserve to be here, your identity is valid. And that was high schoolers were telling me that, and I was so, like, nervous and worried in my transition, and they were all holding me. They're like, oh yeah, that's like just part of who we are. But that's something that I always bring back, is that all of these movements are led by young people. And like I think you said, or we all kind of said at one point, it's so important to know that we are always going to be there for each other, but we have to be more like vocal about it. When something happens to this group of people or this group of people, there's this tendency to be like, oh, that's their problem. But we really need to be vocal about when trans women are, all of these different things, when immigrants, when climate change, all of those things.
So I wanted to say, as somebody who's early 40s to mid 40s, that geriatric millennial baby X, there's a great book by somebody who's also my age, like Heather McGhee, The Sum of Us, where she says that the heart of the problem is that when you get something, the dichotomy is set up in such a way that when somebody achieves a right, the person who doesn't get the right sees something being taken away from them. And that has its source in American racism and in American history. But the zero-sum game is not just black and white. It's immigrant versus citizen. It's man versus woman. It's rich versus poor. It's gay versus straight. What the conservative movement has managed to do in this country is turn everything that you can think of into a zero-sum game. If I get a vaccination, then you're forcing me to not get a vaccination. Everything is discussed in a zero-sum way, and it's incredibly damaging to our system and to our democracy. The example that she gave in her book over and over again was the public pools, right? So part of the New Deal, Roosevelt goes to each community and creates these public pools, and they're tremendously popular, and it's one of the reasons people love government. Of course, one of the dark secrets of the New Deal is that Southern Democrats, in order to sign off on it, excluded African Americans from the same programs, right? So we didn't get the FHA-backed loans to get the homes or to get the businesses, right? They didn't get those 30-year fixed rate mortgages that they got. We were excluded from Social Security. They put the jobs that were majority black jobs on the table and say these jobs will not be covered by Social Security. So that was the dark secret. In the 60s, when we were brought into that by LBJ, then communities would rather fill their pools in rather than see them integrated. So that zero-sum way of thinking, when black folks and minorities were included, when the Immigration Act was changed in 1965 to be a more colorblind immigration policy, then people turned hard against immigration, right? So the idea is, but the entire society suffers. So now nobody has the public pool, right? When you get rid of funding for colleges or controls that make colleges affordable, because now black people are getting college loans and Latinos and Asians are getting college loans, then nobody can afford, and college isn't affordable for anybody. And that's the irony, is that the zero-sum thinking, you'd rather eliminate subsidizing college programs for everybody than include people of color in it. So filling in the public pool per se. So with these rights, I don't have anything to do with choice. I'm a man. Right? Because it's zero sum, right? So when it comes around to gay cisgender men, then nobody's around for them either. It's like there is a lack of common sense, and I saw with the uptick amongst black men and Latinos for Trump in 2020. Talk about alarming for me. That 15% of African American males voted for Donald Trump. I mean, I was told that it had mostly to do with conspiracy theories and QAnon and all that, but there's a real lack of coalition building right now and big tent thinking, and the fact that in 2016 53% of white women voted for Donald Trump. It's like there's just like something's going on where everything's viewed in a zero-sum way with people, and they're just not willing to. And it tends to be people who are center right in their thinking already.
I'm going to lose a lot of it.
Right, but
and it's driving people in hysterical ways. In hysterical ways.
Yeah, and I think about those 53% of white women, 1 in 3 of them has had an abortion, right? If the statistics are there, right? So that's millions of people. Right. And what you're talking about, which I think is absolutely spot on, is the way in which these kind of policy decisions, right, operate within this landscape of a zero-sum kind of political game, right, where we can't have universal human rights, right, because a right for one particular group or protection for one particular group is seen as a threat to another group. But the other thing that we're talking about here is capitalism, right? We're talking about a private marketplace, right, and a system, a political economy, right, where we're all fighting for crumbs, or we're fighting for where we see there's one pie and there ain't enough for everybody to have a piece, right? And that's by design. Right, it's by those kinds of constraints. You talked about government as being a bundle of resources, right? Well, the marketplace is also a bundle of resources, and we live in the most inequitable, right, maladjusted in terms of our material well-being society in the history of the United States, right? We have the largest gap between rich and poor, and the highest maldistribution and concentration of wealth at the top as we've had in the history of the United States right now. And we don't even have to get into the conversation about who built that wealth, right? What labor, what bodies, what peoples who were extracted and exploited, stolen from, etc. That's a whole nother conversation. But to talk only, I think, about politics and policy, right, is I think only half the story, right? That our economic system and our political economy, the two fused together, are what is creating this competition, right, between different groups who don't feel like we can ever live in a world where we can abundantly all enjoy the vast resources that literally exist, but that are being hoarded and kept from the majority of people.
Exactly.
Going to the military.
Right.
Right. Military.
That's right.
Yeah. As we started this conversation, we talked about Stonewall, and we sort of unveiled the fact that Stonewall in a lot of ways was a transgender movement. So I don't want to leave this conversation without acknowledging and at least lending some of our time to what can we do to support our transgender brothers and sisters more, particularly transgender members of our community that are of color. And excuse me, how do we build greater racial equity? Anyone, all of you, what are your thoughts? Excuse me.
I always just go back to looking at the young people, listening to those who are the most marginalized, and a lot of people that are already doing the work have the answers, but they don't have the resources. So, which is what we've all continuously said. And then another piece about voting, I think voting is so important, but it's really important to know that a lot of people don't have access to vote. And so it's as important for the people that do have access to vote those people that can make those changes. And thinking about, I think there's a mix of social media. We were talking about this earlier about how it's siloed us in so many ways, Facebook, all of these different things, but it's also provided so much celebration and representation for so many young people and people of all ages, trans folks, anyone queer, anyone who's queer, and that's so valuable that we look at around the world, around the country, how many people are just being true to themselves. And just by being ourselves every day and being open and being, celebrated by others in our community and others in general, that's an act of rebellion, and how important that is.
Absolutely. Other thoughts?
I mean, I think that any movement worth its salt is constantly asking itself the question, who has been left out and who has been left behind? And I think that you can ask yourselves and ask ourselves that question at the level of policy, right? There are many different sort of moments in modern political history in the United States where non-discrimination statutes were trans exclusive, or they were on the table was sort of cutting transgender protections out of transgender people out of those bills, right? And so I think we have to constantly ask ourselves those questions at the level of politics and policy: who's left out, who's left behind, right? At the level of culture change, like who's now accepted and who's still not accepted, right? I mean, we know in all of the hundreds and hundreds of anti-trans bills that are being debated and proposed and passed across the states in the United States right now, right, why are people fixated on transgender people? Because transgender people, and particularly transgender women of color, right, are the most vulnerable folks to discrimination, to violence, to all of these kinds of, to incarceration, right, to homelessness, poverty, these kinds of things. And if we as a community and we as a movement are not saying that, like, we're not moving forward or moving on, right, until everyone in our community is enjoying what we have, right? So that, again, it's a different way of thinking about the expansiveness of rights and resources, right? Then we're not doing our work, right? We cannot rest on the sort of the partial progress that we fought very hard to get. Right? We always have to be thinking in our imaginations and in our political work about including everyone. Brian Stevenson always talks about getting proximate, right, to the problem and to the people who are struggling the most and who are most vulnerable. And I think it's really important to do that. And I think about, this from his perspective. I'm a cis white, right, Harvard professor, queer guy, right? I have a lot of privileges, right? I suffer discrimination, these kinds of things, definitely. But I also am at a lot of tables, right? And if I show up at that table and I don't keep that door open and make sure that I'm bringing folks with me to that table or change the table, right? Then I'm not doing that work, right? And I think all of us have to sort of look in the mirror and say, like, where is our privilege? Where is our power, right? And then how do we operate in the world in solidarity with folks who don't have those things, even and especially within our own communities and movements? I think that's vital.
It's very important. We don't say, think, or do that enough.
No.
It's, I always say people who walk around with their little headphones on, tuned into their little piece of existence, all tuned into the same channel, WIFM. What's in it for me? And how do we?
I'm going to use that.
And you may. And how do we turn that back around? Because if it's not going to be some of us, it's got to be. It has to be all of us. But as we think about it, as we bring this discussion to a close, and we think about tomorrow, the future, we're in this month of Pride where we think about who we are and what we do and what we want to do. What words of wisdom, what are your words of inspiration? Looking forward with hope. What would you like our audience to think or know or be aware of as we keep moving forward? Sue?
Well, so my friend Urvashi Vad in 2012, this is probably not going to be visible on screen.
We can use it.
But in 2012, at the New York City Dyke March, she wrote a thing on a file folder that she called the Dyke Agenda. So this was 2012. So marriage equality, she has a little check mark by. She was maybe a year or so ahead of herself, but actually in New York, there was marriage equality. And then here's the rest of it with no check marks. LGBTQ equal rights in the U.S. and globally. Jobs for all. End violence against women and trans women. Racial justice. Immigrant rights. Reproductive justice. End corporate welfare. Progressive leadership at both the community level and the government level. And at the very bottom of her file folder, handwritten, Dyke Agenda, let's keep going.
Yeah.
So even as I am discouraged and not optimistic, I in no way intend to let it go or not continue to engage. So, and I think, you know, I do want to say that these hideous anti-trans laws, proposals, and policies, Texas and Florida, I'm looking at you in particular, but there are a few others, are happening not at the federal level.
Yeah, that's right.
They are happening at the state level.
And local, even in some
And
places.
locally in some places. And so we who are blessed enough to live in Cambridge and even to live in the state of Massachusetts, we have friends and family members who live in other places and spaces. We know people who live in Florida. We know people who live in Texas. We know people who live in Oklahoma. And some of them are people we grew up with, or who raised us up, or were our neighbors and our friends in grade school and high school. And we can be in touch with them and ask them to take action, or even better, take it back 2 steps and explain to them why this particular issue of the right wing going after what they see as the lowest hanging fruit, AKA the most vulnerable people in our communities, why they are doing that, why it is heinous and unacceptable, and why those folks in those places need to get organized, or not even get organized, make a phone call, write a letter, write a letter to the editor of your local, community paper, but get a little bit out of what's in it for me.
Absolutely.
Right?
That's right.
Matt, thoughts?
So, in terms of where I would like to see us in the future, I think that enshrining of other countries like Canada or South Africa can enshrine gay, LGBTQI plus rights into their statutes. Why can't we?
Constitution.
I know. It's like, why can't we amend the Constitution, right? Or at least have federal statutes so we're not living at the whim of the Supreme Court. And I understand. I know it's the filibuster, right? I know that if the Dems had the House, the Senate, and the presidency, it would just be filibustered unless we had enough senators to go to change the Senate rules. But I would hope that in the future we're able to enshrine those laws and expand. And I think, unfortunately, I think it's only done through what's in it for me. And that if people understand that if they're being played off against somebody, it's being done for a reason. Right? If they're playing you off against somebody, they're doing something behind your back, like the 2017 Trump tax cuts, right? A lot of people opened their taxes the next day, and if they lived in a high tax state, the SALT deduction was eliminated. They go, hey, wait a minute. Well, you were so concerned about Mexicans that your taxes went up, right? And in this whole conversation about inflation, nobody's talking about the $2 trillion that the Republicans gave to the rich and corporations, right? But they just focus on COVID aid to the poor. It's like, I think that the conservative movement is brilliant at playing folks off against each other. What I'm hoping in the future is that people see how they're being duped. It's looking at coastal elites, looking at minorities. It's always somebody else, right? And it's like, I would hope that we had a big tent politics that was dominant in 10 years, that made it clear to people that things that are in their interest also happen to be in your interest. Wouldn't it be wonderful if none of us had crushing debt? Wouldn't it be wonderful if all of us had health care? And that if that was the focus, and that's what energized people instead of always going after somebody. I think that that the thing that this conversation has in common is that there's an element in our society that's always going after somebody. And if Americans could say, why is it that this movement is always has to find somebody to go after? There's something wrong with that. There's never a vision of making this a more perfect union or a better society. It's always demonizing somebody or going after somebody else. And if people could just be clear-eyed about that and see what's wrong with that, then I think we'd be in a better place. So, yeah.
So being hopeful.
Yeah, being hopeful. I know we were joking that I was the youngest, so I'm speaking to my generation, but important to really listen and learn from all of you and the work that's been done. And instead of just like being frustrated with the older generations, really learning from what you have done and where you have helped us to be now. And also just knowing that for so many people, they're just trying to survive. They don't have housing, they don't have employment, they don't have all these things. And activism sometimes really is survival. And so it's important for those of us who have resources or have those, different parts that we don't have to worry about every day, that we fight for those who are trying to survive.
Yeah.
Thanks, Tim.
I'm so glad that you went there, because in some ways it connects back to, I'm glad you brought Irv into this. God bless and may she rest in peace and power. Because there are elders and ancestors in the historical record that we should know about. We're robbed of this because we're not taught this in our schools. And so, I'm the historian here, so I want to make a pitch to looking to the past, right, in order to inform where we are, our understanding of where we are, and give us fuel, right, and inspiration for the future, right? If you are watching and you don't know who Urvashi Vad is, Google Urvashi Vad, find out who she is, read Virtual Equality, right, and everything that she did, right? If you don't know who Bayard Rustin is, right? Google Bayard Rustin. If you don't know who Sue Hyde is, come hang out with us. Come hang out with us. But Google Sue Hyde, right? Who's one of the most important movement organizers in our community, in our movement in the last half century. I don't mean to date you, honey. I mean, but we're living here with the queer history, people who have made that change, right? And I think about this all the time when I teach the first ever LGBTQ politics and policy course at the Kennedy School. The history of the Kennedy School. I was the first openly queer faculty member in the history of the school in 2005. So better late than never. I still teach the only course there. Every student who takes that class, they start reading this stuff. They're like, I didn't learn any of this. Not even Stonewall in some cases, right? And only that has entered into the curriculum recently, right? But they don't know, and they what they find on the pages of history, right, and the stories that are told by the elders who are still with us, right, is a past that can give inspiration, give illumination to the present and inspiration to the future. And I really do believe that I go to the past as a kind of muse for my own activism and citizenship and work in the world, right? And I think that more of us need to do that. We need to find our roots, right? So that we can build our wings. And then I also think, to your point, I want to repay the kind gesture of what you just did, which is that I think older generations, the intergenerational thing is so crucial. We as older folks need to listen to you all and follow your lead too, right? Like we can't be like, oh, the kids, they're so wokety woke, okay, at least they're awake, right? They're ready to rumble, they're ready to move, they'll get to go, And I think that intergenerational thing is so crucial. And I just want to say this, we're living at a moment in history where we have the first time in the history of the country, maybe the world, 4 generations of out queer people living simultaneously in the same place and time, right? This is an unbelievable resource and wellspring, right? So let's not fight each other across identity or generation, right? Let's get to work together, right? Because we have an untapped resource for a kind of revolution that is yet finished. And I just think, let's get to it, right? This is an amazing moment.
It is an amazing moment, and you have been an amazing panel of folks. You've been uplifting and thought provoking, and it's really wonderful. And I'm just so happy as we're sitting in the middle of what I say Pride Month. This is our opportunity to remember that Pride is 365. It didn't start in June. It doesn't end in June. It is ongoing. To some of the points that you made, and what came to my mind is, we are all responsible for our own education and our own liberation. And that's the only way we get there. We cannot let it be someone else's task, chore, responsibility to make sure we know about us. I always say, and in fact, you may not remember this. So I got on this thing about telling our own stories. I'm sure you've heard that old proverb that says, when the lions start writing the history books, the hunters won't always win. Yes. And so we have to be thoughtful about that. We have to be very thoughtful about it. I go out with my children often, and they always say, yes, don't tell us that story one more time. But I'm going to tell you more than one time, because I want you not only to remember it, I want you to take it inside your being, and then I want you to push it out into the world, because that's what our responsibility is. So you're right. I am so hopeful and happy that we have folks like Pooja and Suri, more than I can even name, that are out there, as you say, we're not walking behind or in front, but alongside. And those that are interested and see it as important to tell these stories that we do not write down enough. Yes. I might add, I was getting ready to say, Sue gave me the first opportunity to even teach a class at a Creating Change conference about writing your own story, because I was so tired of going to funerals and other memorials where we, our partners, spouses, were just written right out of the narrative, because who was left in control, was not comfortable with who we are. We have to be very intentional of passing those stories around and on and forward. So I am just so pleased to have each of you here this afternoon and sharing your stories and having this very great conversation. It gives me energy to keep going forward. I'm hoping as we continue these conversations, we'll be able to have Suriana with us and Reverend Irene, who was trying to be with us, we're going to be bringing this back so that we can continue this conversation. So I just want to say thank you. Thank you for tuning in and turning on. And just remember that we are all important, and together we are better. Thanks for joining us.